The year was 1943. The world was engulfed in the chaos of war, and in the offices of British intelligence on Whitehall, an unusual idea was about to be born, an operation that would deceive the entire German command. By that time, the Allies were preparing for one of the key campaigns of World War II, the invasion of southern Europe. The next target after North Africa was Italy, the so-called soft underbelly of the Axis. But where exactly would the blow fall? Sicily seemed the obvious choice. It was the natural stepping stone for an invasion, and because of that, it was also the most dangerous. Every German and Italian general knew that Sicily was the logical next step. The island was heavily fortified, bunkers, minefields, artillery positions. The Wehrmacht expected the Allies to strike there, and that was precisely the problem. How could one attack the obvious without walking straight into the trap? The answer came from the world of illusion and deception. The art of deception. By 1943, British intelligence had already mastered the art of misdirection. Operations such as Operation Bodyguard and Operation Fortitude would later become classics of psychological warfare. But Mincemeat, Operation Mincemeat, was the first truly audacious performance. It was not just a trick of numbers or fake radio messages. It was a story, a believable human story, that would lure the enemy into a false conclusion. In an age when war was fought with steel and blood, British intelligence was preparing to use words, imagination, and a dead man. The idea sounded absurd. Use a corpse to deceive Hitler's generals. But behind that absurdity lay a precise calculation. The human mind believes in stories more readily than in statistics. Seeds of the plan. In early 1943, as the Allies planned their invasion of southern Europe, a small team in the British Admiralty's Section 17M, a division dedicated to deception, began searching for a way to convince the Germans that the invasion would strike not Sicily, but Greece and Sardinia. If the Wehrmacht shifted its troops and reserves eastward, Sicily would be left vulnerable. One of the section's members, a naval intelligence officer named Charles Cholmondeley, proposed a daring idea: to use a dead body carrying false documents. This concept wasn't entirely new. In 1939, British intelligence had considered similar methods, but they had never been put into practice. Now, however, the stakes were high enough to take the risk. Cholmondeley shared the idea with another officer, a brilliant lawyer and strategist named Ewan Montague. Together, they began shaping what would become Operation Mincemeat. Shadows of strategy. The goal was simple in theory: to make the Germans believe that the Allies were preparing to invade Greece and Sardinia, while Sicily would be used only as a diversion. To achieve that, the British needed not just false papers, but a complete illusion. A body would be found, apparently a victim of a plane crash at sea, carrying a briefcase full of secret documents about the upcoming invasion. The body would wash ashore on the coast of neutral Spain, where the local authorities, friendly to Germany, would inevitably share the information with Berlin. From that moment on, the deception would take on a life of its own. Birth of the Phantom. The plan was audacious to the point of madness. They needed a body, real enough to be believable, but not traceable. They needed documents, real enough to fool even the most skeptical German intelligence officer. And above all, they needed a story, a biography for a man who never existed. In those days, British intelligence operated like a theatre troupe. Officers, doctors, writers and scientists came together to create one of the most elaborate performances of the war. Operation Mincemeat, Montague would later recall, was not an operation of spies but of storytellers. Thus began one of the most unusual chapters in the history of deception, a tale where imagination and precision would decide the fate of thousands. The heart of British intelligence in 1943 was a world of quiet corridors and cigarette smoke, where the fates of armies were often decided by the stroke of a pen. Inside one of those rooms in Whitehall, two men, Ewan Montague and Charles Cholmondeley, worked late into the night, surrounded by folders, code books, and cups of cold tea. They were not ordinary officers. Montague was a naval intelligence lawyer with a taste for puzzles. Cholmondeley, an eccentric Air Force officer with a long nose and an even longer imagination, had a flair for ideas that sounded insane. Until they worked. And on that cold winter evening, they gave birth to one of the strangest and most brilliant operations in military history. The problem, as Montague later wrote, was to find the right man for the job, one who could not complain, a man who could pass for a Royal Marine officer, someone who would not be missed. In January 1943, a London coroner named Bentley Purchase discreetly helped the team locate the body of a man who had died of pneumonia after ingesting rat poison. His lungs were filled with fluid, a crucial detail, since it would appear that he had drowned at sea. The man's true name was Glyndwr Michael, a homeless Welshman, but history would remember him differently. To the Germans, he would become Major William Martin, Royal Marines, a fictional officer with a fiancée, a father, a bank account, and, most importantly, a briefcase full of secrets. Crafting the illusion. The next weeks were devoted to creation, not of weapons, but of a life. Montague's office became a kind of stage set. He and his small team created Major Martin's identity, down to the tiniest detail. Identification papers signed by real officers. Theatre ticket stubs from London's West End. Letters from a loving girlfriend, Pam. A bill for a new shirt. A receipt from a London club. Every item had to look authentic, slightly worn, touched by human life. Cholmondeley even went so far as to arrange for a photograph of Pam. He borrowed an image from a colleague's secretary, a young woman who had no idea she was about to become part of a deception that would fool Hitler himself. The documents. But the true core of the illusion lay in the documents. Inside the briefcase that would be chained to Major Martin's wrist were letters between senior Allied commanders. They discussed plans for an invasion of Greece and Sardinia, suggesting that Sicily was merely a diversion. The wording was carefully chosen, not too direct, not too obvious, but convincing enough for any analyst in Berlin. A decoy letter from Pam was added for good measure. It began innocently. "Darling, I do wish you could be here tonight," and ended with an emotional flourish. The letter smelled faintly of perfume. It was human touches like these that made the illusion believable. Operation Mincemeat takes shape. By March 1943, the plan had been refined to the smallest detail. The operation received its code name, Mincemeat. The body of Major Martin would be transported by submarine to the southern coast of Spain, near the town of Huelva. The Spanish authorities, officially neutral but sympathetic to Germany, were known to share intelligence with the Abwehr, German military intelligence. The hope was simple, that the false documents would reach the Germans and be taken as genuine. The moment of truth. Before the mission, Montague and Cholmondeley arranged a final inspection. The body, dressed in full military uniform, lay quietly in a sealed container filled with dry ice. In his breast pocket were the small personal effects of a man who had never lived. A photograph of Pam, a theatre ticket stub, a letter from his father, and around his wrist, the briefcase, the heart of the deception. As they stood over the makeshift coffin, Montague whispered, "Let's hope our man plays his part well." Cholmondeley smiled thinly. "He's got the easiest job in the world," he replied. "He only has to look dead." In the following days, HMS Seraph, a British submarine, would carry the Major toward his final destination, the coast of Spain, and the stage of one of the most brilliant performances in wartime history. The submarine HMS Seraph sliced through the dark Atlantic waters, its engines humming quietly beneath the waves. Inside, sealed in a metal canister packed with dry ice, lay a man who would soon deceive the Third Reich. It was the night of April 30th, 1943. The crew had been briefed only partially. They were transporting special cargo. Few knew that within that cold cylinder rested a weapon of imagination, a dead man carrying the fate of the Mediterranean in his pocket. The last farewell commander, Bill Jewell, the captain of Seraph, had been chosen for his calm precision and steady nerves. As dawn broke over the Spanish coast near Huelva, the order came to surface. The men gathered silently on deck. The sea was cold, grey, and eerily still. Jewell read a brief prayer from the Book of Common Prayer. No names, no ranks, no ceremony. Then they lifted the body of Major William Martin onto the waves. He floated gently for a moment, pushed by the wind toward the shore. Attached to his wrist, the leather briefcase containing the precious documents. Attached to his chest, the hopes of the Allied deception. "Godspeed, Major," Jewell murmured. With that, the submarine turned back to the deep, leaving behind the man who never was. The Discovery. At 9:30 a.m., a Spanish fisherman named José Antonio Rey Marín noticed a shape bobbing near his nets. When he pulled it aboard, he saw the uniform, the insignia, and the chained briefcase. By noon, the local authorities had been notified. The British vice-consul in Huelva, Francis Haselden, quickly became involved. Following the carefully planned script from London, he requested the return of the briefcase, feigning anxiety that it might contain top-secret naval material. But the Spanish, bound by bureaucracy and curiosity, delayed. They passed the contents to their own intelligence service, and from there to the Germans, just as London had hoped. The German connection. Within days, reports reached Berlin. The Abwehr station in Madrid, headed by Admiral Karl Erich Kuhlenthal and his brilliant analyst Baron Rudolf von Röhne, received copies of the letters. They read them eagerly. The documents appeared genuine. They detailed Allied plans for invasions of Greece and Sardinia, hinting that Sicily was merely a diversion. There were no signs of forgery. The handwriting, the paper, even the fold marks looked natural. Von Röhne, an experienced intelligence officer, studied every clue. The tickets, the receipts, the letter from Pam. They all fit perfectly. "This is authentic," he declared. "The English would never risk sending such papers unless they were real." His report went straight to Admiral Canaris, head of the Abwehr, and from there to Hitler himself. The dictator's belief. By early May, the German High Command was convinced. Hitler, already obsessed with the Balkans and expecting an attack in Greece, found confirmation in Major Martin's documents. Orders were issued. Reinforce Greece and Sardinia. Reduce defences in Sicily. Move panzer units toward the Balkans. For the Allies, the ruse was working better than anyone dared imagine. Back in London, meanwhile, in a small, smoke-filled office in Whitehall, Montague and Cholmondeley waited. Days stretched into weeks. Each intercepted German signal was analysed for signs of belief or suspicion. Then, one morning, the news arrived through decrypted Enigma messages. Enemy forces reinforcing Greece. Sicily considered secondary. Montague allowed himself a rare smile. "Our man has done his job," he said softly. Cholmondeley poured 2 cups of lukewarm tea. "To Major Martin," he said, "the finest officer who never lived." They raised their cups in silent salute. The final proof. To maintain the illusion, the British arranged a funeral in Huelva. On May 1943, under the hot Andalusian sun, Major William Martin, Royal Marines, was laid to rest with full military honours. His grave bore the inscription, "William Martin, Esquire." Born 1907, died 1943, beloved son of John Martin, Esquire and dearly loved, fiancée Pam. Spanish civilians watched respectfully. None knew that beneath the flag-draped coffin lay the body of Glyndwr Michael, the Welsh drifter whose final role had changed the course of a war. The chain reaction. Within days, the ripple spread. German troops were diverted, panzer divisions redeployed, Luftwaffe squadrons repositioned to Greece. In occupied Sicily, the defences weakened. Operation Mincemeat had achieved its goal. The man who never was had become one of the most effective secret agents in history, without ever drawing a breath. Spring 1943. The war in the Mediterranean was approaching its climax. North Africa was nearly liberated, and the Allied command was preparing for the next crucial move, the invasion of southern Europe. To ensure success, it was essential to conceal the real direction of the strike. Thus began one of the most daring deception operations in the history of warfare. Operation Mincemeat. A theatre of shadows. By April, everything was ready. A body, the main character of the deception, had been prepared, dressed in a British naval officer's uniform, and equipped with an entirely fabricated identity. In his inside pocket lay documents that would change the course of the war. The target of the operation was the mind of the German High Command. If they could be convinced that the Allies were planning to invade Greece or Sardinia instead of Sicily, the deception would save tens of thousands of lives. The body was placed inside a sealed metal container, labelled as optical instruments. On the morning of April 17, 1943, the British submarine HMS Seraph departed from the Scottish coast under the command of Lieutenant Norman Jewell. Its destination was the southern coast of Spain, near the small town of Huelva. The voyage of the dead man. For days, Seraph moved silently through the waters of the Atlantic, skirting the Iberian Peninsula. The crew knew only fragments of the mission. Jewell himself was instructed to open the sealed container only upon reaching the Spanish coast. On the night of April 30th, under the cover of darkness, the submarine surfaced near Huelva. The officers carried the container onto the deck, opened it, and silently lowered the body into the cold water. Attached to the wrist was a briefcase, the key prop of the performance. Inside were letters, military maps, and correspondence between senior Allied officers, all pointing to Greece and Sardinia as the next invasion targets. The tide carried the body toward the shore. By morning, Spanish fishermen would find it. Discovery and confusion. On April 30th, 1943, at dawn, the body was discovered floating near Huelva. Spanish authorities quickly retrieved it, and soon the British naval officer became the centre of diplomatic and intelligence intrigue. Officially, Spain was neutral, but its government had many Nazi sympathisers. British intelligence counted on this. They hoped that the documents would reach the Germans, but not too quickly and not too obviously. The local British consul, H.A. Hazelden, was notified immediately. Feigning ignorance, he followed the standard diplomatic procedure, demanding the return of the body and the briefcase, as though it were a tragic accident. Everything unfolded according to plan. Spanish officials reluctantly agreed to return the documents to the British, but not before discreetly sharing them with the German attachés in Madrid. The hooks are set within days. Fragments of the secret letters reached German intelligence. The documents seemed authentic. The signatures, the phrasing, the handwriting. Everything matched genuine military correspondence. German experts examined the paper under ultraviolet light, even tested ink traces. Nothing suspicious was found. The deception had taken hold. Meanwhile, in Berlin, the Abwehr, German military intelligence, presented its report to the High Command. The contents were clear. The Allies were preparing to invade Greece and Sardinia. Sicily was mentioned only as a diversion. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr, personally endorsed the report, forwarding it to Hitler's headquarters. Hitler takes the bait, May 1943. At the Wolf's Lair, Hitler pored over the captured documents. They aligned perfectly with what he already wanted to believe, that the Allies would strike the Balkans to link up with the Yugoslav partisans and move toward the Danube. For the Führer, this confirmed his preconceptions. He ordered additional divisions to be transferred to Greece and the Peloponnese. German artillery was redeployed, the Luftwaffe concentrated in the wrong region. Meanwhile, the Allies were finalizing preparations for the real invasion, Operation Husky, targeting Sicily. British delight. In London, the officers of MI5 and the Naval Intelligence Division followed each development through encrypted diplomatic channels. They learned that the Germans had fully accepted the bait. The false papers were being analysed and distributed among Axis commands. Ewan Montague, one of the operation's masterminds, wrote later in his diary, "The fish swallowed the hook, the line, and even the sinker." For the men of British intelligence, it was the culmination of years of psychological warfare, a silent victory achieved without a single shot fired. The role of Spain. Spain's involvement was crucial. Its officials never officially admitted sharing the documents with the Germans, but both sides knew what had happened. The chain of intermediaries, Spanish officers, German diplomats, Abwehr agents, worked precisely as the British had hoped. The documents were returned to London later, subtly altered but intact enough to maintain the illusion. In a report to Churchill, one intelligence officer summarized the situation in a single line. "The Germans believe what we wanted them to believe." Silence before the storm. By early July 1943, Axis forces in Greece and the Balkans were on high alert. Reinforcements had been sent from France and Italy. The Mediterranean defences near Sardinia had doubled, and at the same time, German divisions in Sicily were weakened, expecting only a feint. On the night of July 9-10, Allied troops landed on the beaches of Sicily. The Germans were caught completely off guard. The deception had worked. Perfectly. The invisible victory. For the team behind Operation Mincemeat, it was a triumph, not of weapons, but of imagination. A body, a briefcase, and a handful of forged papers had altered the strategy of an empire. Later, analyses confirmed that Hitler's decisions, based on the false documents, delayed the German response by crucial weeks. The success of the Sicilian invasion marked the beginning of the end for Mussolini and the collapse of Axis power in southern Europe. The body of Major William Martin, Royal Marines, the man who never was, received a full military burial in Huelva, Spain. His gravestone remains there to this day, bearing the inscription, "Greater love hath no man than this." July 1943. The Allied invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky, had begun. Under the blazing Mediterranean sun, British and American troops stormed the beaches, while German command frantically tried to understand what had gone wrong. The deception, so carefully woven, had done its work. The Axis had been led astray, and the door to southern Europe stood open. A triumph of shadows. Within days of the landings, the Germans realized their mistake. But by then it was too late. Hitler, convinced the Sicilian assault was merely a diversion, delayed sending reinforcements until July 13th. By then, Allied forces had already established a solid foothold on the island. Intelligence reports later showed that over 90% of German divisions sent to Greece and Sardinia had remained there for weeks, waiting for a second, non-existent invasion. Every battalion pinned down in the Balkans meant fewer defenders in Sicily, fewer bullets, fewer lives lost. The success of Operation Mincemeat became a silent yet decisive factor in the Allies' Mediterranean campaign. As Churchill famously said after the victory, "In war, truth is so precious that she should always be attended by a bodyguard of lies." The man who never was. Meanwhile, in Huelva, Spain, the man who never existed became a legend. Locals attended the funeral of Major William Martin, a British hero whose body had washed ashore carrying vital documents. The British consul arranged a solemn burial with full military honours. Only a handful of people knew the truth. The grave belonged to a Welshman named Glyndwr Michael, a homeless man who had died in London months earlier. In death, he had become an officer, a hero, and an instrument of history. For decades, his identity remained classified. It wasn't until the late 1990s that researchers uncovered his true name, and the British government officially acknowledged his role in one of the most remarkable deceptions of World War II. On his headstone today, an additional inscription reads, "Glyndwr Michael served as Major William Martin, Royal Marines." The aftermath in intelligence circles. In London, MI5 and naval intelligence quietly celebrated. Reports confirmed that the Germans had fully believed the operation's narrative. Messages intercepted through Ultra, the Allied code-breaking project, proved that Hitler had ordered major troop movements based on the false information. The masterminds of the deception, Ewan Montagu and Charles Cholmondeley, received discreet commendations. Montagu later wrote in his memoirs, "We gave the enemy exactly what he was waiting to find. The truth wrapped in a lie." Their work set a precedent for psychological warfare, blending art, strategy, and human intuition in ways the world had never seen before. Ripples across history. Operation Mincemeat did more than save lives. It reshaped the very concept of military deception. Its success validated the broader Allied plan known as Operation Bodyguard, which later covered the Normandy landings with an elaborate web of misinformation. The idea was the same. Make the enemy believe what he wants to believe, and he will deceive himself. From Mincemeat came the inspiration for later operations like Fortitude, the fake army under General Patton that convinced Hitler D-Day would come at Calais, not Normandy. The ghosts of deception, born in 1943, continued to shape the war through its end. The cost of secrecy. For decades, the men behind the operation remained silent. The documents were sealed, their success unspoken. The story began to surface only in the 1950s, when Montagu published The Man Who Never Was, later adapted into a film. Even then, many details remained classified: names, methods, and the identity of the body. Those who knew the truth carried it quietly, proud of what they had achieved, yet aware that their victory had come through illusion and manipulation. As one of the officers later remarked, "We built an empire of shadows, and it saved lives. But shadows leave no medals." The ethical question. In retrospect, Operation Mincemeat remains one of the most fascinating examples of the moral ambiguity of war. Was it right to use a human body, to turn death into a weapon? Even Montagu admitted that the ethical weight of the decision never left him. Yet the result was undeniable. Thousands of soldiers survived who might otherwise have died. Deception had become a form of mercy, a paradox that still stirs historians and philosophers alike. Legacy and memory. Today, the story of Operation Mincemeat is taught in military academies around the world. It serves as both a lesson and a warning, a testament to the power of imagination in warfare. In Huelva, visitors still come to the cemetery where Major Martin rests. They leave flowers and notes, some addressed to the man who never was, others simply saying, "Thank you." In museums and archives, replicas of his briefcase, the forged letters, and the naval uniform stand as reminders of an operation that blurred the line between truth and fiction. The last word. Looking back, Operation Mincemeat was more than a ruse. It was a symbol of human ingenuity under the pressure of war. It demonstrated that intelligence is not just about information, but about understanding the human mind, its fears, its desires, its need to believe. A dead man had changed the course of a war, and in doing so, he proved that sometimes the greatest victories are won not on battlefields, but in the imagination.